During the busiest morning rush of the year, Derek Halston shoved Ethan Calder into the glass display counter and coffee splashed down his worn work jacket. Derek laughed and called him a broke repairman begging for handouts in front of CEO Evelyn Winthrop. No one moved. Ethan straightened himself, gathered the fallen folder, and asked Derek whether he was certain he wanted to put his hands on him again. Evelyn rose so fast her chair scraped the floor. She looked at Derek and said, "You just shoved the man who holds the legal right to shut down every location we operate." The entire cafe went silent. If stories like this one keep you watching until the very last word, subscribe now and stay for every turn this one still has left to make. Morning Foundry and Finch hosted the most important gathering in its 20-year history. The cafe was already alive before sunrise, its original copper espresso fixtures gleaming under warm overhead lights, and the smell of single-origin medium roast moving through the space like something that remembered itself. The location sat on the corner of a narrow Chicago block where the building's brick face had never been repainted, where the front window still wore the etched script Rachel Calder had chosen in the weeks before the grand opening, and where the floors were the same wide plank hardwood Ethan had sanded himself on a borrowed machine one October weekend 2 decades earlier. Nobody had rescheduled the signing ceremony for the $750 million hospitality acquisition that afternoon, because of weather, staffing shortages, or nerves, and the 12 current members of the Winthrop Coffee and Hospitality Board expected every detail of the flagship to project the kind of effortless excellence that justified 9 zeros on a term sheet. Derek Halston had arrived before 7, before the first barista had unlocked the street-level door, and he had immediately begun turning the cafe into the version of itself that existed only in the reports he submitted to the home office. He instructed the opening crew to move 3 machines with visible error lights into the back hallway and cover them with a tablecloth, to replace the customer feedback binders on the host, stand with a set of blank ones, and to send 3 of the longest tenured staff members home for the day under the pretense of a schedule adjustment. Since their worn uniforms and the casual ease with which longtime employees addressed regulars by name struck him as details that read as informal rather than welcoming. Nina Brooks, who had managed Foundry and Finch for 6 years, and who understood the difference between the cafe as it was and the cafe as Derek described it, raised an objection when she saw one of her best baristas' name scratched off the staffing board with a grease pencil. But Derek placed both hands flat on the counter and told her in a low, even voice that the whole location could be flagged for administrative review before the end of the week if she could not manage a single morning without creating friction. Ethan Calder appeared at the side entrance just after 8, carrying a steel toolbox in his left hand and a battered accordion folder under his right arm, the brass key to the original roasting system clipped to the outside of his jacket pocket, where it caught the light once and then disappeared against the dark fabric. He had not announced himself to the front security position because Evelyn Winthrop had invited him directly, and the arrangement had been made through her personal assistant rather than through Derek's office calendar. But when Ethan reached the lobby threshold, the guard on station did not find his name on the approved visitor manifest because Derek had removed it 2 days earlier after he discovered the meeting existed. Derek noticed Ethan standing near the entrance, took one long look at the aged jacket, the toolbox, the folder that was clearly older than several members of his regional team, and concluded without further inquiry that the man in front of him had wandered in, hoping to pick up a service call that had already been assigned to someone else. He crossed the room with the brisk confidence of someone who had never once been wrong about a first impression, stopped 3 feet away, and said the cafe was not taking walk-in contractors today. Ethan said he was not a walk-in contractor. He was there to inspect the roasting room and to see Evelyn Winthrop. Derek tilted his head, let the pause stretch just long enough to feel deliberate, and asked him what possible reason a man in a work jacket with tools would have to address the CEO of a $750 million enterprise by her first name. Ethan looked at him without hurry and said, "Because she's been waiting for my signature." On the wall directly behind Derek, half hidden by a new promotional banner that had been mounted just that morning, hung a framed photograph of two people standing in front of an unfinished counter with paint cans at their feet and enormous exhausted grins on their faces. And the man on the left wore a much younger version of the same quiet expression that Ethan Calder carried now. Evelyn arrived through the main entrance, 11 minutes later, with Lucas Benton at her left shoulder, a senior investor named Grant Colby at her right, and a second investor named Patricia Morse walking a half step behind, and Derek transformed himself so completely in the seconds between spotting the group and stepping forward that anyone watching might have thought he was a different person than the one who had just told a man he had no business asking for the CEO. He shook hands, gestured wide across the cafe with proprietary pride, described the renovation timeline he had personally overseen, the customer satisfaction ranking he had brought the region to, and the proprietary roasting process that he referred to, with practiced casualness, as the brand's most significant competitive advantage. Ethan had not moved from his position near the service counter, and he did not try to interrupt the welcome sequence, because he had arrived with the intention of watching first, and what he was seeing in the way the remaining staff moved around Derek's orbit, deferential and slightly angled away the way people position themselves near something that might shift without warning, told him more than any operational report could have. Derek caught Ethan's presence in his peripheral vision and understood immediately that a man who had just claimed to be there for the CEO was still standing in the room, and that this created a problem, because if this person spoke during the introductions and mentioned anything about broken equipment or missing calibration logs, the entire morning's careful architecture collapsed. He pivoted toward Ethan with his chest open, and his voice carrying, loud enough for the investors and the nearest cluster of staff to hear, and asked whether Ethan was there looking for employment because he wanted to be upfront that the brand had minimum standards regarding professional presentation, prior hospitality experience, and an understanding of what an upscale operation required from the people representing it. Ethan said he was not there to apply for anything. Derek asked why he kept looking in the direction of the CEO, and the way he phrased the question let it carry a suggestion that clung to it like smoke, the implication that a man with worn-down work boots and no title was angling for the sympathy of a wealthy woman, rather than conducting any legitimate business. Two of the junior directors near the bar area made small sounds that were not quite laughter but wanted to be, and the three baristas, visible at their stations, stared at the espresso handles they were wiping down with a concentrated attention that had nothing to do with the machines. Evelyn was still deep in her exchange with Grant Colby and had not processed the exchange fully, but she caught the tail end of it as Derek reached out and snatched the accordion folder from under Ethan's arm in the same motion someone might use to take a prop away from a child at the wrong moment of a performance. The contents came loose, and invoices, maintenance logs, a folded legal document, and a small photograph of a woman laughing behind a cafe counter scattered across the hardwood floor. Ethan stood still and told Derek to pick them up. Derek stepped forward, placed the toe of his dress shoe against the edge of the photograph, and said, with the kind of slowness that meant every word was chosen, "A man who can't protect his own work shouldn't expect anyone else to respect his history." Nina had crouched to gather the loose pages before she fully registered the name printed in the upper corner of the legal document, and when she did, She stayed very still for a moment, and the name she had just read was Calder. Derek believed the quiet warning Ethan had offered in those last seconds, before everything changed, was a provocation designed to embarrass him in front of the CEO, because that was the framework through which he understood all challenges to his authority. Someone was always performing, always positioning, and the correct response was to perform harder and position faster. He stepped close to Ethan, placed one hand firmly on his shoulder, and in a voice meant to project managerial resolution rather than anger, told him to apologize to the room for causing a disruption and then locate the service entrance on his own. Ethan did not raise his voice, did not step back, and did not accelerate, and the absence of reaction seemed to compound Derek's certainty that he was dealing with someone who needed to be physically redirected, because stillness without deference read to him as defiance. He pushed, not with his full weight, not with rage, but with the flat dismissiveness of someone removing an obstacle, and Ethan's shoulder met the glass display case hard enough to rattle the cups on the shelf behind it, and a full ceramic mug of coffee that had been resting on the counter edge tipped and emptied itself across the left side of Ethan's jacket and pooled at the base of the dropped toolbox. The room stopped. Not the gradual quiet of a crowd noticing something worth watching, but the instantaneous stop of people who understood without deliberation that something irrevocable had just happened. Derek glanced at the watching faces and said Ethan should count himself fortunate the security team hadn't escorted him out 30 minutes earlier. Evelyn Winthrop had already crossed half the length of the cafe. She reached the display counter, bent down without breaking her stride, and picked up the brass key that had fallen from Ethan's jacket pocket, and she held it for a moment in her closed hand, and then looked at Derek with the expression of someone cataloging an error in real time. She asked him whether he understood who he had just put his hands on. Derek said the man was an unauthorized repair contractor who had been disrupting the operation since his arrival, and who had refused repeated requests to leave. Evelyn looked at him and said, very clearly, "You just shoved the man who holds the patent that runs every roasting system in every location we operate." The investor standing 3 feet to her left stopped writing mid-sentence. Evelyn did not stop. She said Ethan Calder was also the co-founder of Foundry and Finch, the legal owner of the building they were all currently standing inside, a founding shareholder in Winthrop Coffee and Hospitality who had never diluted his position, the only individual whose signature was required to extend the licensing agreement before the acquisition closed, and the one person in the state of Illinois with the contractual standing to trigger a full operational audit that would freeze every transaction on the table until it was resolved. Derek's face lost its arrangement. He pulled it back together in under 4 seconds and said it was clearly a misunderstanding that they could resolve privately. Ethan had not been looking at Derek during Evelyn's list. He was looking at the staff, at Nina standing with the recovered pages still in her hands, at the barista nearest the machine whose apron was twisted at the waist from how long he had been holding himself carefully still, and at the woman at the register who had not looked up once but whose breathing was visibly controlled. He said aloud, to no specific person, "Why didn't anyone step in?" The silence that followed was heavier than the first one, and Nina finally said, without raising her eyes, "Because he made everyone believe that speaking up meant losing the job." Derek's change of posture was immediate and architectural, the way a man who has spent years building advantages shifts from offense to demolition when the ground moves, because he understood in the seconds after Evelyn's statement that he could not unsay what had already been said in front of 2 institutional investors and the entire floor staff, but he could still reframe what it meant. He stopped describing Ethan as a trespasser and pivoted to characterizing him as an opportunist, a founding stakeholder who had spent the better part of 2 decades absent from the operation, who had accepted compensation and retired to private life, while the Winthrop family and its executive team had done the actual work of turning a single-corner cafe into a 240-location enterprise spanning 3 time zones. He addressed Grant Colby and Patricia Morse directly, speaking at the tempo of a prepared briefing, explaining that in acquisitions of this scale, it was not unusual for legacy contract holders to surface at strategic moments and leverage dormant rights to extract additional financial concessions, and that the founding documents contained language giving Ethan limited audit privileges that had never been intended as an operational veto, but could be misread that way by someone motivated to delay. Before the assembled investors, Derek offered a constructed version of recent events in which Ethan had abandoned the brand after his wife's death, leaving a single underperforming location while the Winthrop infrastructure had built the enterprise around it, in which the Calder patent was a contractual artifact rather than the engine of the business, and in which the scene at the counter had been a security misunderstanding provoked by Ethan's refusal to follow standard visitor protocols. Ethan did not respond emotionally to any part of it. He asked Derek to produce the complete unedited footage from the cafe's interior cameras, covering the period from 7 in the morning to the present moment. Derek said the recording system had experienced a technical failure overnight and that the footage from that window was unavailable. The coincidence settled in the room with a particular weight, and Evelyn caught it, and Lucas caught it, and the investor Patricia Morse wrote something in the margin of her notepad and then capped her pen. Evelyn asked Lucas to lock all digital operational data from the location immediately and to remove Derek's administrative access to the building systems pending review. Derek turned to her and said in a quieter voice that allowing the word of a man in a work jacket to pod a transaction of this magnitude would invite questions about her leadership that would be difficult to answer once the story reached the board. The pressure on Evelyn was architectural in its own way. If the signing did not occur that afternoon, the stock position of the company would move before morning. The board's confidence in her stewardship of the deal would crack in ways that Derek would be positioned to exploit, and hundreds of millions in committed capital would have to be walked back to investors who had made public statements in support of the acquisition. Ethan watched her absorb all of it and saw the thing that happens to someone who genuinely believes in the institution they lead when they discover the institution has been doing something the belief cannot contain. He did not threaten the company. He only said, "I don't need you to trust me. I need you to be willing to examine the people you already do trust." Evelyn told Derek that Ethan would be given 3 hours of unobstructed access to conduct a technical review, and that no one from Derek's team was to enter the roasting room or modify any equipment during that window. 3 floors above them, Derek's phone was already in his hand, and his thumbs were moving. The roasting room at Foundry and Finch was not large, but it had been built with the specificity of something designed by a person who intended to be the one maintaining it for decades. Every junction panel, labeled in Ethan's own handwriting, every calibration point color-coded in a system he had taught Rachel over a long weekend when the first machine arrived on a rented pallet truck. Ethan entered the room with Evelyn, Nina, Lucas, and Derek, who had insisted on being present, and who stood near the doorway with his arms crossed in the posture of a man overseeing an inconvenient formality. Derek remarked to no one in particular that the technology had evolved significantly since the era when the cafe had been a single-location operation, and that contemporary roasting engineers used monitoring platforms that bore very little resemblance to whatever analog methods Ethan might have been accustomed to. Ethan opened the primary control housing, inserted the brass key into the diagnostic port that existed on every original Calder pulse unit, and had never been publicized in any manual or technical document, and accessed the audit mode that he had designed precisely because he had always understood that the most important data in any system was the data that no one thought to falsify. The display resolved into two parallel data columns, and the divergence between them was not subtle. The first column contained the formatted operational reports that had been transmitted to the corporate technical office on a monthly schedule. The second column contained the raw machine logs stored in the onboard controller's isolated memory, and the two records described different cafes entirely. The logs showed that the premium single-origin bean specification required under the Calder Pulse licensing agreement had been replaced with a commodity blend at a price point roughly 40% lower, that the roast temperature curves had been manually adjusted to compensate for the quality differential in a way that technically produced drinkable coffee while masking the substitution from casual tasting, that the automated cleaning cycles had been skipped on a pattern that corresponded to weeks when Derek's regional schedule showed him as based in another city, that the safety filters on 3 of the 4 active burner units had been reinstalled past their certified service limit, and that every automated warning the system had generated over the preceding 14 months had been dismissed from an administrative account registered to Derek Halston. Derek said the data had almost certainly been altered by Ethan himself, possibly during prior visits to the location or through remote access, and he said it in the tone of someone who still believed audibility was the same as credibility. Ethan asked Lucas to check the creation timestamps on each log entry and to cross-reference them against the digital sign-in records from the building's visitor system. The logs predated Ethan's most recent access to the building by 8 months, and several of the most significant discrepancy entries had been generated on dates when Ethan had been in a different state entirely, which Lucas confirmed by pulling the flight booking on his phone. Nina reached into her jacket pocket and produced a small accordion folder of her own containing paper invoices for parts and consumables that she had been collecting for 11 months and storing in a zip pouch at the bottom of her apartment's filing cabinet. The unit prices listed in Derek's regional procurement reports were, in several cases, 5 times higher than the amounts shown on the actual supplier invoices, and the name of the company appearing as the billing intermediary on nearly every inflated transaction was Halston Service Solutions, the ownership of which could be verified in under 4 minutes through a publicly accessible commercial registry that listed Derek's younger brother as its sole registered officer. Evelyn asked Derek when he had last disclosed a family business relationship to the company's Conflict of Interest office. Derek said that Ethan and Nina had clearly coordinated this in advance, and that the presentation had the structure of a deliberate attempt to damage him professionally on the highest visibility day of the fiscal year. Ethan opened the final directory in the audit log, and there, time-stamped for 11:58 that evening, was a scheduled command string that would have pushed the number 4 burner unit past its thermal threshold in a way the machine's internal failsafe had been partially disabled to permit, and the window in which it was set to trigger corresponded exactly to the time of the evening's signing ceremony. The roasting room went quiet in a different way than the cafe floor had, because the people in it understood systems, and understanding systems meant understanding what it looked like when one had been aimed at something rather than simply failing. Evelyn stood with her back to the control panel and asked Ethan the question she had been holding since the moment she had retrieved his brass key from the floor. She asked why a man who held a patent generating royalties across 240 locations had spent the last several years accepting serviced calls for broken refrigeration units in borrowed commercial vans. Ethan took a moment before answering, not because he was uncertain, but because the full answer contained a person he did not offer casually to rooms full of people who had not earned it. He and Rachel had opened Foundry and Finch with the combined savings from 3 years of dual incomes, a short-term loan from Rachel's mother, and a decommissioned industrial roaster that Ethan had rebuilt from component level over 4 months in a rented garage. Rachel had designed the menu, built the service philosophy from first principles, and spent her first operating year learning the names of every regular customer within 2 weeks of their first visit, and Ethan had engineered the roasting process until it did something that no production-scale system had managed before. It produced a cup of coffee that tasted the same on the 100th batch as it had on the first. When Evelyn's father had approached them about a licensing arrangement and regional expansion, Ethan had agreed on 5 conditions that he had written out by hand and insisted be incorporated into the founding contract verbatim. That every employee across the expanded brand be paid a living wage without exception. That quality standards not be adjusted to serve margin targets. That the original Foundry and Finch location remain operational in perpetuity regardless of its individual profitability. That the Calder Pulse system never be deployed outside its safety specifications, and that the founders retain the right to intervene if any of those conditions were being systematically violated. 18 months after the first licensing agreement was signed, Rachel was diagnosed with a condition that moved faster than the specialists had predicted, and by the time Sadie was 9 years old, Ethan was the only parent she had. He had not abandoned the brand. He had made a choice about which thing he was unwilling to fail at, and once Sadie was old enough to understand the choice, she had told him she was glad he had made it. He kept his shares and his patent rights and his audit privileges, but he had stepped away from anything that required him to be somewhere other than home at a predictable hour. And the service repair work was not a cover story or an act of self-effacement. It was the work that kept him closest to the physical reality of what the machines he had designed actually did in the hands of people who had not built them. He was not poor. He was someone who had decided that a great deal of what wealth was supposed to demonstrate was something he already knew about himself. Evelyn absorbed this without speaking. She had grown up inside the Winthrop name, which meant she had grown up inside the story the name told about itself, and she was now sitting with the knowledge that the actual origin of the things she ran was a photograph on a wall that her own vice president had covered with a banner advertising a seasonal beverage. She said that the hardest part was not knowing what Derek had been doing. She said the hardest part was knowing that every person in her flagship location had known something was wrong for months and had understood that telling the truth was a faster route to unemployment than staying quiet. Lucas's phone lit up on the edge of the counter, and he looked at it and told them that Derek had just submitted a formal complaint to the board's legal channel, accusing Ethan of deliberately triggering a false equipment alert to create grounds for a license suspension and demand a 9-figure settlement. The emergency board session convened by video within the hour, and Derek appeared in the tiled grid of faces with the composure of a man who had rehearsed this particular emergency and knew where all the furniture was in the dark. He described himself to the assembled directors as a regional officer who had discovered an attempt to use founding document privileges as financial leverage, and he described Ethan as a long-absent stakeholder who had chosen the highest value business day of the year to resurface with technical claims that could not be independently verified in the available time. Several board members aligned with Derek's position within the first 5 minutes, not out of loyalty to him specifically, but out of a structural preference for the transaction completing on schedule, because a delayed signing meant public questions, and public questions meant price movement, and price movement meant phone calls from funds that had been told the deal was closed. The contingent that pushed for postponement was outnumbered, because Derek had spent 3 years building board relationships precisely for a moment like this one. One director noted that the founding documents gave Ethan audit rights in specific violation scenarios, but not a general operational veto, and that characterizing his access as a shutdown authority was legally imprecise. Another said that any patent holder absent from active management for 14 years carried a diminished moral claim on operational decisions regardless of contract language. Derek then submitted to the board a diagnostic summary prepared by his own technical team, which he had apparently commissioned sometime in the previous 2 hours, showing that the anomalous equipment command Ethan had identified in the audit logs had been initiated using a founder-level access credential associated with Ethan's original system registration. Ethan studied the document on Lucas's screen and identified within 40 seconds what it actually was. Someone had taken the access credential from the backup controller unit stored in Derek's regional office and used it to generate a log entry that would, if accepted at face value, reattribute the dangerous command to Ethan's own account. The board was now asking Evelyn to suspend Ethan's audit rights pending a third-party review, to sign the transaction documents on the original timeline, to restore Derek's system access, and to transfer custody of the roasting equipment to a technical team operating under Derek's oversight. Evelyn refused the last item immediately and without discussion. The rest she could not yet refuse with the evidence as it currently stood, because the board was not wrong that a timestamp alone, without proof of the credential duplication, left the attribution question genuinely open. Nina said quietly that Derek had a practice of requesting that the main server room be left running through Friday nights with remote access enabled, something he had asked her to facilitate on at least 7 occasions, always with a reason that sounded administrative, and always scheduled for times when no technical staff were in the building. Ethan looked at the architecture of it. The backup controller in Derek's regional office, the Friday night remote sessions, the delegated administrative account that carried just enough privilege to copy a credential string without leaving a standard audit trail. He said he needed the board to keep Derek in the room for 4 more hours. He said he was going to give Derek the thing he most wanted to delete, and then he was going to wait and see whether Derek was patient enough not to reach for it. Evelyn walked back into the cafe's main floor and announced to the assembled investors, staff, and board members still present on video that the signing ceremony would proceed on the original schedule and that the technical review had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. She said this in the same voice she used to present quarterly results, grounded, specific, and completely without hesitation. Derek's posture unlocked in a way that was visible from across the room, his shoulders dropping a half-inch, his jaw releasing a tension he had been holding since the moment Evelyn had named Ethan's credentials out loud. Evelyn told Ethan that she needed him to step away from the roasting room until the board had completed its review and the sentence was delivered with just enough formality that it could only be read as a capitulation by someone who did not know what had been agreed in the stairwell 14 minutes earlier. Ethan left through the front entrance, and the expression Nina watched him carry out. The door was one she had never seen on a person who intended to stay gone. Derek collected himself and addressed the remaining floor staff with a warmth that had not been present that morning, saying that today was a demonstration of exactly why strong operational leadership mattered in moments of stress, and that even the CEO had recognized that the company's future could not be held hostage by the grievances of someone who had chosen personal convenience over institutional commitment. He then pulled Nina aside and gave her a list. The list contained the physical timesheet binders for the past 3 years, the parts procurement invoices in the back office filing cabinet, the maintenance contract copies stored in the manager's binder, the operational data files on the legacy standalone drive that was not connected to the corporate network, and a small secondary camera unit mounted above the fire exit that had been installed by Ethan in the original construction and had never been integrated into the system Derek managed. He told her to have all of it cleared from the location before 7 o'clock. Nina said she understood, and she began collecting the materials, and she carried 2/3 of them directly to Lucas Benton's car in the parking structure 1 block east. Ethan had not gone home. He had gone to the sub-level mechanical room, accessible through a utility corridor in the building's foundation that was keyed to the same brass fitting as the roasting room's diagnostic port, because the building was his, and buildings contain rooms that only their owners know completely. He was not listening to anything private. He was monitoring the system logs from the original network node that the building ran on independently of the corporate infrastructure, which was within the scope of his ownership rights in a way that required no interpretation. Derek, believing the location was secure, called his brother from the Café manager's office using the business telephone line, which automatically logged and archived all outbound calls per a regulatory compliance policy that Derek had approved but apparently never read. And in the course of that conversation, he told his brother to have the acquisition documents for the building prepared and ready to execute the moment. Ethan's founding status was formally challenged because the property had been systematically undervalued for 2 years, and the gap between current assessed value and actual market rate was the real reason any of this had been worth the effort. He said, in the same call, that the profitability problem at the location was not an accident. He said a cafe that lost money was a cafe that could be purchased for what the land was worth. Lucas received the call transcript automatically through the archived business communications platform. The bait file Ethan had created was named Founder Authorization, and he placed it in a directory that Derek's technical team would see as a repository of the original licensing documents, and he made it visible from the access credential that had been used to generate the false log entry. The Founder Authorization file appeared in Derek's monitoring feed at 4:47 in the afternoon, and he stared at it for 90 seconds before he made the decision that people who believe they are the only clever person in a room always eventually make. He used the copied credential, accessed the directory, and initiated a delete command, and the system he used to do it was his own corporate workstation, running on his own network profile, authenticated through his own biometric login, and at the moment he executed the command, the Calder Pulse diagnostic system recorded the device identifier, the network address, the security fingerprint of the terminal, the time to the nearest second, the administrative account that had enabled the credential duplication, and the specific deletion instruction as it was entered, and it packaged all of it into a signed verification file and transmitted a copy simultaneously to Ethan's phone, to Evelyn's tablet, and to the archived legal correspondence folder that Lucas maintained on the company's document server. Derek did not know this had happened. He straightened his jacket, reviewed his remarks for the signing ceremony, and walked into the main cafe floor with the expression of a man who had managed a complicated day and arrived at the outcome he had always been working toward. Evelyn had asked the full floor staff to remain present for the signing, and Derek read this as staging, as her desire to have witnesses who were emotionally invested in the company's success, arranged in the background of what would become a widely circulated photograph. Ethan came through the front entrance wearing the same coffee-stained jacket he had been wearing that morning, and he did not move quickly, and he did not look around the room before he looked at Derek. Derek demanded to know who had authorized his return. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, produced the brass key, and placed it on the table beside the signing documents. He said, "The person who owns the room." Derek told him his audit rights had been suspended by board vote, and that his presence at the ceremony was a violation of the board's directive. Lucas set a bound copy of the original founding agreement on the table next to the brass key and said that the board's suspension authority under the founding document was conditional on the absence of active fraud evidence, and that the evidence currently documented met the contractual threshold required to keep Ethan's rights fully intact. Ethan asked Derek to explain to the people in the room why an access credential registered to Ethan's founding account had been used from Derek's corporate workstation at 4:47 that afternoon to delete a file from a directory that Derek was not supposed to have access to. Derek said the entire technical framework had clearly been constructed and seeded in advance to discredit him. Ethan agreed with him. Yes, and you were the only person who walked into it on your own. The lights went out. Not gradually, not with a flicker, but all at once, the way a building goes dark when someone cuts power at the source rather than cycling a circuit, and the cafe became the color of the last available light, which was the amber coming in through the west-facing window in the last hour before Chicago's summer evening arrived. Derek had moved toward the back corridor. In the same second, the room went black, and he was reaching for the portable storage drive in his jacket pocket when the original Foundry and Finch electrical system, designed by Ethan as a completely independent backup circuit drawing from a dedicated panel that shared no junction with the corporate-managed power grid, came online. The cafe's original incandescent pendant lights rose slowly to their full amber warmth. The central display screen rebooted from the offline server cache. The copper espresso fixtures caught the light the way they had on the day Rachel had stood behind them for the first time and told Ethan she thought they had actually done it. Derek stopped moving. The binders of evidence were already on the main table. Evelyn stood in front of the assembled investors, staff, and board members remaining on the video feed and walked through what the documents showed without editorializing and without apology. She described the bean substitution and the temperature adjustments. She described Halston Service Solutions and the inflated procurement invoices and the gap between what suppliers were paid and what Derek's reports claimed. She described the stolen wages from the timesheet alterations, the maintenance funds that had been billed but never spent, and the deliberate suppression of the cafe's profitability figures to create the conditions for a below-market property acquisition by a company registered in his brother's name. She described the thermal override command and the time window in which it had been scheduled to trigger. She described the recorded phone call and the deletion attempt from Derek's own terminal and what the forensic timestamps confirmed about the credential duplication. She described the push at the display counter and the camera that Derek had tried to have removed, and the footage that had been preserved. Derek, when the last document had been displayed, turned to Nina and named her, and then turned to a junior technician named Landon Wheeler, who had been standing near the espresso bar with his arms at his sides throughout the entire proceeding. And he said that both of them had been working around him and feeding information to Ethan in a coordinated effort to remove him from a role he had built through years of genuine contribution. Ethan said, "That's how you've run this place. You always keep someone smaller standing close enough to carry the weight when it falls." Evelyn told Derek that his employment was terminated, effective immediately, and that his building access, system credentials, and corporate accounts were all revoked as of that moment. Lucas told him that the documented material would be provided to the relevant regulatory and investigative authorities and to the company's insurance carrier by close of business. The security team walked Derek out of Foundry and Finch through the same front door where he had stood that morning, deciding that Ethan Calder was the kind of person the world was built to move around. At the threshold, he stopped and said Ethan had only won because he had held onto a set of old paperwork. Ethan looked at him and said, "No. You lost because you believed the man in the old jacket didn't know his own worth." After Derek was gone, the board convened again, and the investors were still present, and several of the directors who had supported Derek's position an hour earlier were now very careful about where they looked when they spoke. And the dominant request from the remaining quorum was that Ethan sign the renewal documents immediately so the acquisition timeline could be salvaged before the markets opened. Ethan did not sign. He had not come back through the front door for the signature. He had come back to initiate the 72-hour audit window that the founding agreement gave him, and he did so by the book, formally, with Lucas as his legal witness, and the entire event logged in the document system. The audit required every one of the 240 Winthrop coffee and hospitality locations to halt new vendor contracts, freeze procurement, and submit to a verification review covering employee compensation records, ingredient sourcing documentation, maintenance histories, equipment safety status, and any outstanding contracts with entities connected to Derek Halston's network. The financial exposure was real and significant. A 72-hour operational freeze at that scale, with a major acquisition already announced to the market, was not a formality. Evelyn knew the board would interpret her support for the audit as a stability risk, and she gave it anyway. She stood in front of the same camera link that Derek had used to present his fabricated diagnostic report, and said that she was accepting full institutional responsibility for the conditions under which the misconduct had been allowed to develop, that the board needed to understand the failure had not been a single rogue officer, but a management culture that had turned fear into a workflow, and that she was not going to resolve the situation by removing the person most visible in the documentation while leaving the incentive structure that had made him possible. The conditions Ethan attached to his renewal were not punitive, and they were not negotiated from a position of personal grievance. He required full restoration of all wages taken from employees through timesheet manipulation to be processed before he would sign anything. He required the establishment of an independent reporting channel for safety and labor concerns, operated by a third party with no reporting relationship to any corporate executive. He required a profit-sharing structure for employees who had been with the company for more than 3 years. He required a permanent covenant protecting the Foundry and Finch location from closure or sale, regardless of its individual financial performance. He required that the maintenance fund for all locations be subject to third-party auditing on a quarterly basis. He required that every employee at every location have the documented right to refuse operation of equipment they believed to be unsafe without fear of disciplinary action. He required that managerial performance evaluations include structured assessments of how each manager treated the people they supervised. Several board members said the conditions would reduce short-term returns in ways that would complicate the acquisition terms. Evelyn said, "An empire isn't worth what it costs if it has to be built on the silence of the people it uses." The transaction did not collapse. The acquisition partners, informed of the audit and given access to the same documented evidence that had just removed Derek from the organization, concluded that the disclosed compliance failure was manageable, and that the transparency demonstrated by the CEO's response was a meaningful indicator of institutional quality. They agreed to hold on a revised schedule pending audit completion. Ethan signed the conditional renewal after the first batch of restored wages was confirmed by payroll, and he signed it at the same counter where a cup of coffee had been pushed off its edge and ruined a jacket that he still had not replaced. 6 months later, Foundry and Finch had been restored to its original interior. the renovation undoing what 3 years of Derek's management directives had done to it. The pendant lights back at their original height, the dark promotional panels replaced with the same open wall space that Rachel had believed was the most important design choice in the place because it gave the room to breathe. The framed photograph that had been half hidden behind the seasonal banner was now centered on the wall facing the entrance, and beneath it, on a small brass plate, was the line Rachel had written in the founding document, and that Ethan had insisted be embedded in every renewal agreement since, built so that everyone has a place to sit. Nina Brooks had been appointed Regional Operations Director for the Midwest, with a scope that covered 11 locations and a mandate that included a specific performance metric for how quickly staff concerns were formally acknowledged and acted on. The employees whose time records had been altered received full restoration of what they were owed, and a portion of Derek's forfeited equity position was converted into a hardship fund administered by a committee that included floor-level staff alongside management. Ethan did not take a corporate title. He did not move into an office. He accepted a formal role on the company's Independent Operations and Safety Council, which met quarterly and which had the authority to request a full compliance review at any location with cause, and he continued accepting service calls from independent restaurant operators who needed someone who understood what was actually happening inside their equipment. Sadie came to the reopening of the cafe on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, and she stood for a long time in front of the photograph of her parents with the paint cans at their feet and the enormous grins. And she told her father that Rachel would have been deeply satisfied to know that Foundry and Finch had not become the opposite of what they had built it to be. The last customers left as the early dark of late autumn settled over the block outside, and Evelyn sat down across from Ethan at the small table beside the window that had always caught the best of the afternoon light and now caught the reflection of the original pendant warmth. She told him that her greatest failure had not been in trusting Derek, because she had trusted him within a system designed to make him trustworthy on paper, but in creating a system that made it more dangerous to speak than to be silent, and that she understood the difference. Ethan said that her failure and her correction were both now part of the record, and that the record was the only honest way any institution kept its shape. Evelyn asked whether he believed there was enough trust between them to keep building something together. He said trust was not made in a single afternoon or a single decision, but she had started rebuilding it the right way, and that was more than most people allowed themselves to do. She invited him to dinner on a night with no lawyers present, no board members, no contracts requiring countersignatures. He said yes, but told her they were going to have coffee at Foundry and Finch first. As the two of them were fishing, a young staff member who had started the previous week came to clear the table, glanced at Ethan's jacket, and asked whether he was the repair technician who had been in earlier. He smiled and said, "Yes, I fix things that other people have decided are too far gone to save." Evelyn looked around the cafe that had once gone silent out of fear, now full of voices layered over each other in the easy way of a room where people felt comfortable staying longer than they needed to, and she thought about the single father in the worn jacket who had been shoved into a glass counter in front of everyone, and had not fallen, and had not run, and had not taken the empire. And she understood that what he had done instead was make it worthy of the woman whose name still lived in the etching on the front window.